Hold this. Oh no! 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 No!
Pizza time.
You kid. Your eyes do not deceive you. That's Spider-Man 2 from the GameCube PS2 era, running on the Steam Deck. Arguably the thing that I think most of the gaming industry is talking about right now, especially because people are actually receiving them finally. And mine came through. I was in quarter 2, so if you're in quarter 2 as well, it's probably a matter of time before you get your email. But one of the biggest things that I was looking forward to the most as far as the Steam Deck was concerned, outside of being able to simply just play your Steam library on the go, was being able to emulate via the Linux-based desktop system. And I'm a huge fan of emulation, especially after discovering how it actually works and doing my research and actually figuring out the actual internal mechanics of how to get emulation going. I thought to myself, how far can the Steam Deck get pushed with emulation? A lot of people thought about that, but I specifically had my eyes on the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man trilogy from the mid-2000s. A series of games that I personally grew up with, especially when I was getting into my huge admiration for the Spider-Man franchise with the Raimi trilogy and the subsequent games that came out with them. So I thought to myself, how does the Steam Deck fare off against the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man trilogy from that era? So a couple of things to break down before I get into the minutia of this video, which is essentially going to be how the Steam Deck runs those, or rather emulates those games. Let's break down exactly how I feel about the Steam Deck overall. I would say I'm quite frankly pleased and really surprised by the ergonomics of the system. Obviously you can see it's rather huge, but upon feeling it firsthand here, it actually feels much more comfortable than I was anticipating it. I was expecting it to feel a little aloof, especially with the way that the joysticks and the face buttons are placed. But after some time, I thought to myself, actually I'm not feeling too bad as far as the wrist joints and the comfortability is concerned. At least as long as I'm double-handing this thing. Pause. Once you liberate one of the hands, I definitely start to feel the scales tipping against me here, because then it's when the weight generally feels. So that's one thing that I picked up from the get-go. But once I got past the installation of the Steam OS, kind of messed around with the system and figured out how to install things properly, link my Steam account, all that stuff, I did find it to be, for the most part, a little intuitive. I would probably say my biggest problem is that keyboard, bringing up the keyboard, not just in Steam OS, but obviously the Linux desktop system that you have to switch onto. Having to press the Steam and X button to bring up the keyboard so that not only can I just type something in, but also be able to get emulation running on this thing was a cumbersome task, because bringing up that keyboard, it should be much more intuitive. Oh shit. We're going to be emulating the Spider-Man trilogy via each individual emulator per respective platform. I know it's some extra work on my part, but I appreciate the sense of freedom, being able to toggle the native resolution within each system from 720 to 1080, being able to lock the frame rate as well as the aspect ratio, being able to tell the system to prioritize Vulkan over OpenGL source, and all that good stuff. So being able to have that sense of freedom and toggle it individually, I felt I wanted that just a little bit more. So let's go ahead and cut to the chase and start off with the 2002 Spider-Man game. So with the 2002 Spider-Man game brought to you from Activision and Treyarch, I decided to start things off with the PlayStation 2 version because I had already grown up with the GameCube version. So I thought to myself, let's load up PCSX, I think it is. I always get the letters messed up, but PCSX2, the PlayStation 2 emulator, and loaded up the 2002 Spider-Man game. And I decided to give it a run by just loading it up without changing up the settings, and for the most part it ran proper, except for there was that aspect ratio flickering, especially when I pointed Spider-Man in a particular direction within the New York sandbox. Once I moved the camera with the other stick, then it acclimated to the 16:9 stretched aspect ratio and stayed that way, running at a smooth 60 frames per second. but whenever I pointed Spider-Man back into that specific like northeastern direction of the sandbox, it would then cut back to that back and forth. I don't know if it had something to do with the depth of field or the assets it was trying to generate in the distance, but it kept happening. So I thought to myself, let me go back into the settings for the PS2 emulator, change it to force the 4:3 aspect ratio and stay that way, and then therefore the flickering was completely gone. It loaded up the pre-rendered cutscenes, the in-game cutscenes, as well as the gameplay overall in the smooth 4:3 aspect ratio, as well as 60 FPS. And for the most part, as you can see, it loads up and plays rather well. I would probably say from time to time there was a little bit of a stutter, but there was also another little detail that I noticed as I kind of cycled the camera and rotated it around, especially when it got to the more chaotic action sequences, like trying to go into the subway station and rescuing those police officers from Shocker's goons, is when I noticed that the game will then generate assets. It would generate assets as the camera rotated, so assets were never placed in the environment all in one time. It was only generating the ones that you would see on camera, and sometimes the camera would be a little bit too free-flowy for the game to catch up, or at least the internals of the Steam Deck to run those assets in real time, that I would see them pop in as I moved the camera. It was just something that kind of stuck out to me as I played the game, and it wasn't on just that particular level. It did happen a little earlier when I was trying to track down Uncle Ben's killer, and that's pretty much the gist of the PlayStation 2 version. So I thought to myself, alright, let's go back to basics, jump into some nostalgia, and load up Dolphin to test out the GameCube version of the Spider-Man 2002 game. And what you're seeing here is footage of the GameCube emulator Dolphin running 2002 Spider-Man. And for the most part, it runs just as well, if not probably better than the PS2 version, because not only is the targeted 60 FPS pretty much consistent, I rarely saw any kind of jitter, maybe once or twice whenever there were like some fire effects, especially within the warehouse when certain cans of oil blew up or things like that. I was battling it out with Vulture and he would shoot out those little energy things whenever he thrusted through the air, and then trying to fight the goblin with his glider. So whenever particle effects, there was probably a frame rate dip once or twice here or there. But for the most part, a very thorough, intuitive, and smooth experience, especially when it came to the button layout, because obviously the GameCube layout of where it places its buttons upon the controller is going to be significantly different than that of the PlayStation 2. And for the most part, the buttons were definitely placed on the right scheme. I just had to switch the X and the B, because obviously on the Steam Deck the B is the outermost button rather than the inwards button, and I'm just so used to being able to punch with Spider-Man via the inwards button, which in this case is X, but on the GameCube controller it's the B is on the inside. It's the red button on the inside. So I had to remap that. The PlayStation 2 emulator didn't have to do that, because obviously it's mimicking a DualShock 2 or DualShock, whatever you prefer to call it, and therefore that was the only little hurdle that I had to jump over. Otherwise, that whole issue I was having with the PS2 emulator loading assets as I rotated the camera never happened. I decided to try to flex the Dolphin emulator as much as possible, and every time I would rotate the camera and I would jump into some of the more frenetic sequences, assets were in place, nothing was lost. I don't know if maybe it's because Dolphin or GameCube is a little more low lift than the PlayStation 2 was, but everything was just in place, you know what I'm saying? And possibly because of my nostalgic tendencies growing up with the GameCube version of Spider-Man 2002, it's probably my preferred console of choice when it comes to emulating this particular game. God, this is anxiety. Now on to Spider-Man 2, what is arguably the most beloved out of the three, not just for the movie, but also for the game. And following completely suit, I don't know if this was intentional, I don't know if it was in the stars or in the web of fate, but Spider-Man 2 is arguably the best running game for the Steam Deck, at least if you're playing on the Dolphin GameCube emulator. And I'm not just playing favorites here, because I'll show you the footage right here. This is how Spider-Man 2 runs on the PlayStation 2 emulator. I don't know if it's a restriction or a limit on the Steam Deck, or maybe I didn't configure my settings right. Maybe it has something to do with Vulkan or the graphics card inside of the Steam Deck, but textures would just not load up properly inside of the engine for Spider-Man 2 whenever I was either in the in-game cutscenes, like you can see with the Statue of Liberty's face not even recognizable, or certain title cards not appearing on the screen. And then jumping into gameplay, the textures all over the environment. Spidey's the only one that's completely untouched here. literally the rest of New York and even some of the NPCs on the street would not have their textures properly load up, though the frame rate is still consistent. This, frankly, to me, especially because of how much I cherish this game from 2004, I did not feel it to be appropriate to try to jump too deep into Spider-Man 2 without the proper textures in place. So I don't know if somebody out there could pitch a recommendation as to how to fix this issue within the PS2 emulator inside of Steam Deck to get this game up and running, but I arrived at the conclusion that PS2 simply just doesn't run on the Steam Deck via PlayStation 2 emulator, whether it be integrated into SteamOS, because that's when I had my instance that it wouldn't boot up at all I got was just a black screen, or running on the individual emulator through the Linux system, I would get these texture issues. Frankly, none of this was found when I loaded up Spider-Man 2 on the GameCube emulator Dolphin. Just like with the first Spider-Man, completely seamless, completely intuitive. Once I got my 4:3 forced aspect ratio running at the smooth 30 frames per second, yeah, strangely, Spider-Man 2 doesn't run on 60 FPS despite toggling the native resolution, but as you can see here, it's super crisp and clean. I updated the resolution to 1080p natively, but still forcing the 4:3 to make it sure that it's as closely resembling to the original experience as possible. The button mapping was completely intuitive. I don't think I even switched anything, unlike the first game, and it just ran seamless. No texture pop-ins, nothing at all. It was literally like I was playing the original GameCube version, so much so that this was the game, out of everything that I tested out on the Steam Deck, this was the one that I was playing for so long, the Steam Deck finally had to tell me, hey, plug this in, I'm about to die. And it's not just because of how well it was running on the Steam Deck to begin with, but overall, I think we can all agree, Spider-Man 2, the best of this Tobey trilogy when it came to gaming and the movie itself, that you could just spend hours just swinging. It's just so good, and it's absolutely no mistake that they managed to get some of those developers to work on the web swinging for the PS4 Spider-Man, because there's definitely a pedigree there that should not go undermined. No. Which is why it's so baffling that we decided to take a step back with Spider-Man 3. Yeah, so I definitely wanted to see how the Steam Deck handled Spider-Man 3, and I understand that there's a PlayStation 2 version that I can then load up the PS2 emulator back on to test that one out, but the whole purpose of this video and the purpose of running through this Tobey trilogy is to really put the Steam Deck through its paces. So let's load up RPCS3 to load up the PlayStation 3 version of Spider-Man 3 through the PS3 emulator, and following the distinct pattern of how we peaked at Spider-Man 2, not just with the movies but also with the games, the emulators for all three of these games practically does not break any of that whatsoever. As you can see from this footage of the PlayStation 3 emulator running Spider-Man 3, this is the limit. And I know that practically an awful lot of other tech enthusiasts, people who managed to get their Steam Deck first and ran it through its paces, try to run the highest end emulators to see exactly what this little mini machine can do, pretty much all agreed that the PS3 and the Xbox 360 is really the cap. That's really the cap, because that's when you're going to have your fair share of games that kind of run a little smooth, and then some that just don't run at all. And somewhere there in between is Spider-Man 3, where from the beginning I noticed the hefty amount of stutters, but at the same time I remember that PS3 itself, especially in 2007 when we had the big fat glossy one, was also struggling to run this game even internally. So I thought to myself, okay, let's keep pushing it past the opening tutorial sequence. Yes, I'm seeing quite an awful lot of frame rate dips. It's a very uncomfortable experience to play, especially not just because the game overall is not that great, but also because the emulation's not doing it any favors with the lagginess, with the slowdown of not just the frame rates and the gameplay itself, but also the audio. You have Bruce Campbell trying to tell me what to do, and he's talking like this. It's just so imperative to the gameplay, but I managed to push through all the way to getting to that classic and very memeable QuickTime event.
Help! Please! Someone! I'm going to die!
Just never gets old. But after getting our opening title sequence to break down our voice actors, kind of foreshadow our characters, that's all rendered in-game on the PlayStation 3 version, Then the experience came frankly to a full stop, where the game then, similar to the PlayStation 2 version of Spider-Man 2, frankly, unplayable. But not so much because of textures or even frame rate, but it's out of all things, it's the overexposure of the sun that brought everything down to a screeching halt. Not only am I getting frame rate dips down to like 10 to 15 frames a second, but you can see right here that the sun just blows out the image completely. It starts off rather balanced and realistic in the sense of how the shaders and the lighting and the light beams inside of the sandbox of the game are working properly, but after literally just a handful of seconds, the whole thing just blows out that I can barely distinct any kind of quality, texture, or detail amongst the assets of the world, whether it be the skyscrapers, the NPCs, or even Spidey himself. And not only that, but also, of course, the intuitiveness and the smoothness and the momentum of swinging is just completely botched by the frame rate, that this whole experience was just nauseating. No! Ah, son of a bitch. Can I do it again? I'm gonna get fired. So, okay, I decided to take a step back and told myself, even though I did not play this version, I jumped straight into the PS3 because I had a PS3. Let's try the PlayStation 2 version of Spider-Man 3. And though it was able to be loaded up within the PlayStation 2 emulator, immediately I started to experience the same issues as far as frame rate lag, audio lag, some gameplay stutter, as well as some assets not loading up within the world, specifically skyscrapers. It was technically a slightly smoother experience, and we didn't have any of that sun exposure blowout. I can actually see Spidey, I can actually see the environment and NPCs talking to me, but it was still a jumbled mess running within the PS2 emulator, which is really ironic because this is supposed to be the downgraded version of Spider-Man 3. It's not supposed to be in HD, it's supposed to be in the 4:3. I even tried toggling the native resolution inside from the 1080 that I had Spider-Man 2 on to 720, and then even to a very fuzzy 480p inside of the engine, and it still ran like trash. I don't understand why. Maybe it's still harkening to the PlayStation 2 emulator issues that I was having with the prior two games, or maybe it's just the fact that Spider-Man 3 is just not meant to run at all. But I didn't give up. I didn't let the symbiote, give me that negative attrition. I decided to persevere and try to run this thing via Dolphin with the Wii version. Yeah, I thought to myself, Dolphin's on there, and it could run both GameCube and Wii games, and I understand that Spider-Man 3, strangely enough, released on the Wii, despite not getting a cross-release on the GameCube. Let's try to run that. Hilariously enough, this is the most playable version. Frame rate is actually a lot smoother. It's targeting 30 FPS, but I can definitely see dips down to like the 20s or 25s. But I'll happily take that over the 15 to 20 or even 10 that the PlayStation 3 version was running. And of course, it's going to be kind of replicating the engine that was running inside of the PS2 version. You're going to have your 4:3. You're not necessarily going to have your upgraded textures and, upgraded character models, and similar to the PlayStation 2 version, all cutscenes are pre-rendered. They're not running in game. You're not gonna have the crispy HD resolution to every single little detail. But this was arguably the most playable version of Spider-Man 3, and even then there was still one giant hurdle that was making the whole overall experience, at least from the perspective of the Steam Deck, rather unplayable, and that's of course the motion controls. Being that it's running on Wii, it's emphasizing these motion controls, and I understand that there's a way to kind of work around this as far as telling the Dolphin emulator to program what would originally be the joystick shifting or moving, or the nunchuck being toggled or whatever, to some specific motion within either the mouse, which in this case would be the trackpads, or some other kind of input depending on your preference. But that's just so much programming, so much more to do, that I was just thinking back to just how seamless Spider-Man 2 was working, that I just loaded that thing up again and played another handful of hours before trying to even sink another hour and capture more footage of the very frustrating Spider-Man 3. Nice. Did it. I did it.
Good. Everyone got their pizzas.
Except me. You can go for a pizza right about now. It's addicting, right? This was the game that I took to my girlfriend's house, And I just could not put down until finally the console, the Steam Deck itself here, told me flat out, hey, you're about to run out of battery. Yeah, you got to plug this thing in. And I think that just stands to the testament of what the Steam Deck is actually capable of doing. So ultimately, I still feel the same way about the Steam Deck. After playing with it for about a week, that it's most definitely an enthusiast machine, especially if you love programming and emulating and working around the Linux system, and you don't pull your hair out and manage to build up a sense of patience and knowledge and firm affinity with things like this, then definitely you're gonna have a great time with the Steam Deck. But if you want to run things much more intuitively, especially within SteamOS, just take it from me, the PlayStation 3 is at a cap, and test running it through the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man trilogy, I definitely saw that. But just know, out of the three, of course, the one running the best is going to be the Spider-Man 2, which is rather poetic and rather appropriate because we all want that. But running at the absolute worst is going to be the worst game out of the bunch, and the worst movie, Spider-Man 3. Wow, it's just life imitating art, right? So for all of you that are fans of the Spider-Man trilogy from 2002, 2004, and 2007 respectively, whether it be the movies or the games, now that you saw these three games running on the Steam Deck, for better or worse, does this kind of give you an incentive to want to pick up the Steam Deck, whether it be for emulation or native playing through the SteamOS? Have you always had your eyes on the Steam Deck since it was unveiled last year, or is this something that you're definitely going to put off later on when they figure out the bugs and the patches and make the whole overall experience much smoother and cleaner for the player? Let me know in the comment section below. I hope you guys enjoyed this little unorthodox video. I know it's not used to the traditional action figures that I review and cover on the channel for both Spider-Man and Batman, but I thought to myself, I got the Steam Deck for a little while here. Let me give it a test run out of my sheer curiosity with the Tobey Maguire trilogy. Of course, the only thing left to do now is to test out some Batman games, specifically the Arkham series. If you guys want to see that, let me know either in the comment section or by thumbs upping this video. Otherwise, guys, take care, stay humble, and go outside and play. I'm staying here and playing some more Spider-Man 2. Come on, Spidey. Let's go get some pizzas. Hold this. Oh no! 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 Fuck you, kid.